Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, everyone. So, for today's video, I had an idea that I've been wanting to do for quite some time now. And that would be reading to you some creepypasta stories. This is a rather big something that I really enjoy listening to on YouTube is having somebody read me a scary story. I've done it a few times, and I think it could be fun to give it a shot. If you don't know what a creepypasta is, it is a collection of written stories. They could be fake, they could be real, they could be based off of something real and exaggerated. But essentially, it is a scary story that is written by somebody. And they're pretty cool. I really like them. So I've picked 3 of them for today. And I would like you just to sit back, relax, get cozy. There's going to be no jump scares. There's going to be no loud noises. Sit back, relax. I am here with you. You are safe. You are loved. Get a blanket, get a drink, put your earphones on, your headphones. Get somewhere comfortable, quiet, where you won't be disturbed. And let me read to you some of these scary stories. So the first one I have here is called They Were Devils. It's about a 7-minute story. It starts off like this. I was discussing creepypastas with my grandfather. He had never heard the term before, and kind of snickered at it. After I explained to him what they were, he said, we used to just call them urban legends. He wanted some examples, and I gave him a few of the obvious ones, Slender Man, Ben Drowned, etc. I then told him about one I'd recently read, a story called The Milk Boy. It took place in the 1800s and dealt with a young boy who was lured into the woods by men who were long dead. Then he stumbled upon a marble that shelters the dead men's souls. After the boy loses the marble, he becomes obsessed with finding it, eventually murdering everyone in his town. But the marble was gone. The boy failed to recover it. And it's alluded to that he will keep killing until he finds it. I was surprised at my grandfather's reaction after I told him that. He clammed up and became really awkward. I asked him if he was okay, and he only nodded. He then seemed to get weak and lost his balance. I assumed it was just a vertigo he suffered from. My grandmother took him home after that to rest. A week later, my parents and I dropped off some groceries to my grandparents' house. I was a little anxious to see my grandfather since I hadn't spoken to him since the day he had his spell. We went inside, and he was in his recliner watching an old black and white Western movie. He seemed fine now. He smiled and gave me a hug when I went over to him. My mom and my grandmother were in the kitchen, talking and putting away the groceries. That left just me, my dad, and my grandfather in the living room. The Western movie was still on, and none of us were saying anything. I fiddled with my phone. My dad was zoned out, and my grandfather was glued to his movie. Eventually, my grandfather finally spoke up and talked about how his car's check engine light has been on. I thought it was a little odd that was the first thing that he started talking about, and out of nowhere really, but he knew my dad worked on cars. My dad seemed to jump at the chance to escape the awkward silence. Then he went to the garage to take a look at the old car. My grandfather immediately muted the television after that. He looked over at me As I sat on the couch, he swallowed hard and said, "They were devils." I became extremely anxious right away. I didn't know what he was talking about, and everything now seemed a little creepy. I questioned him, and he repeated the same 3 words. They were devils. "Who?" I asked. "The long dead men in the woods, from that story you told me about." I knew then that he was referring to the milk boy. The story I had told him about just before he had his vertigo spell a week earlier. It turns out my grandfather had been told a similar story by his father. As he began to tell me the story, for some reason my instinct was to hit record on the voice memo feature on my phone. Here is what I was able to transcribe from the recording. "When I was little, we lived in New England. It's such a beautiful place. So what I saw and heard seemed very out of place. It was a summer night, a day or 2 before my 10th birthday. I couldn't sleep. The sun hadn't gone down yet, and I still had energy built up from the day. So I went to my window and opened it up. I sat there for almost 45 minutes and watched the sun dip down behind the mountains. When the dark came, I still wasn't tired. So I continued to just sit there. I saw raccoons scamper out of the woods and sniff around the trash cans by the garbage. I saw bats flying above the trees. Those are all normal sights for living where we did. Then, just as I was starting to get tired, I heard some more rustling from the woods behind our house. I assumed it was just another raccoon at first. The moon seemed brighter that night, more than usual, so everything out my window was illuminated by the moon's glow. I saw something dark moving just within the trees, and then it stopped. It moved again, and then stopped. I shook off my fatigue and tried to focus on whatever was moving in the woods. A long shadow then extended from within the trees. It grew long and then disappeared just as fast. The shadow did this again, and then a second shadow joined it. As the shadows stretched across the yard, they reached the trash cans. Trash cans moved as the shadows made contact with them, and one of the metal lids crashed to the ground. That's when I realized they weren't shadows at all. I gasped loudly, and the dark appendages retracted quickly back into the woods like they were scared. As soon as they were out of sight, a horrible, dry howl emerged from the darkness. It shattered my nerves and I fell backward. I rushed to my bed and tossed the covers over my head. I could still hear the howl, but it had faded, like whatever it was now retreating in the opposite direction. I felt dizzy after that, never having experienced such a bizarre moment. I passed out and didn't wake up until the morning. When I woke up, the first thing I did was go to my window. It was still open, and now a musty smell had come in through it overnight. It was foggy outside, so I blamed the fog for the odd scent. The trash cans were still there, and one of the lids was still on the ground. At breakfast, I told my father what I had seen. He didn't say a lot at first, other than I shouldn't have been awake and out of bed at that time. But a little later in the day, after the fog had burned away, I was outside with him, helping carry firewood to the side of the house. He picked up the metal lid and put it back on the trash can. He looked out in the vast sea of wilderness that surrounded our little house. It told me to come closer. When I did, he pointed to the woods. "Is that where you saw it?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He then told me a bizarre story that scared me. and scarred me. About 100 years earlier, there was a family of 4 who lived in our house. There was a sickness that was going around, a virus that made the father ill. He died within days of contracting it. That left only the mother to take care of her 2 children, a boy and a girl. The mother went to work every day, sometimes not coming home for up to 8 or 9 hours. That left the boy to take care of his little sister, at 10 years old. He was the eldest of the 2 children. He would fix meals for his sister, play with her, help teach her things. And one afternoon for lunch, the boy had poured his sister a glass of milk. The milk had gone bad, but he didn't know it. The girl drank it and screamed at the foulness of it. She fell ill immediately, violently throwing up and breaking out in a high fever. The boy panicked and said he would go get help. The closest neighbor was roughly a mile away, but the boy knew that if he cut through the woods, he could save himself about a quarter of a mile. He got his sister comfortable in her bed with a wet rag on her head, and he took off into the woods. He ran and ran, but the woods seemed different to him. They seemed contorted or even backwards. The boy stopped when he realized he was lost. That's when he heard a voice. It was a deep voice, almost inhuman. He looked around but didn't see anyone. He called out, and then he heard the voice again. It was saying, "He'll be the 6th. The boy turned around again, and this time, what he saw made his blood run cold. There was a small group of trees that stood in front of him, each with human remains tied to them. The boy gagged as the overwhelming stench of decay overpowered his senses. The boy heard the voice again. This time, it asked who he was. "Doyle," the boy responded, still unsure where the voice was coming from. The voice spoke again in a different language, but Doyle didn't understand the words he was hearing, but started to hallucinate and see things in front of him. The trees were bare, and a mob of villagers from somewhere were dragging 5 naked men through the woods. They had the 5 men bound and gagged, but the men didn't seem to be putting up a fight. It was almost like they had accepted their fate, or even wanted it. Doyle watched as the villagers tied the 5 men to the trees and condemned them to die for their dark practices, calling them each a devil. One of the villagers held a long blade of some kind, and then systematically went through all 5 men, slicing them open from head to toe. As the bodies all hung there, spilling their blood into the dirt below, the villagers claimed to have all heard ghostly laughter that they assumed came from the dead men. The bodies were left there to rot, and are said to still be in the woods somewhere to this day. Doyle was reported missing that night when his mother came home to find him gone, and his sister dead in her bed. The official story of what happened to Doyle is unclear, but it's heavily assumed that the 5 devils had changed him into a 6th, one more ghastly and repellent than they were. One which unnaturally crawls through the woods, discharging a grim howl, and committing vile acts ordered by the 5 devils. I turned the voice recorder off after that. As my grandfather told me his story, I could see the similarities between it and the milk boy. Both stories took place in the New England area, dealt with similar themes, as well as included a boy named Doyle. My grandfather remains convinced to this day that the shadowy appendages of what he saw coming from the woods that summer night was a more ghastly iteration of Doyle. He said what he saw was real, and combined with the story his father told him, there was no other explanation for what he had witnessed. I can't imagine something like that even being real, but now there seems to be multiple versions of the same story. As I looked deeper into the Creepypasta story, I realized it was part of a larger story called The Wool, which deals with a supernatural entity violently mutilating people in a small town who emits a dry, hollow cry. Now I am convinced that maybe there are more stories like this out there. Maybe other people have heard a terrible cry from deep in the woods in New England. Maybe others have smelled the unexplained foul odors. Whether or not this story is real, my grandfather has never lied to me. I believe him. The fear he feels to this day is undeniably real. Wow. That's an interesting story. I don't think it's real, though. I don't see anywhere on here that shows it's a real story, or that it was based off of anything. Oh. Very interesting, though. I'll leave the links in the description if you want to read it yourself. Okay. So this next one is called Face Mask Required, written by Lady Ravensdale. And the last one that we read, They Were Devils, is written by doesn't say. I think at the end actually it says something. Let's see. Oh, it just says anonymous monster. Okay. Anyways, so Face Mask Required, written by Lady Ravensdale. Here we go. The stillness wakes me. Not that pleasant quite after a winter snow, or the comfortable silence of a sleeping house, but a heavy blanket of non-sound, as if even the air was afraid to stir. I lay in bed, barely breathing, straining to catch even the slightest movement. Nothing. Slowly I rise, not wanting to break the spell. Why is it every action seems so much louder when you're trying to be quiet? Even my breathing sounds harsh, my pulse thundering in my ears. I pad to the window, feet chilled from the polished wood floor. The early morning sun bathes the landscape in weak yellow tones. Snow glints and contrasts with the dark pine woods lining the path from the house to the river. Leaning closer, I can feel the coldness outside seeping in along the frame. I reach out to touch the glass, but my shifting weight makes the floorboards creak. I freeze in place, suddenly apprehensive, as if I don't want anyone to know I'm awake. Is that you, dear? A call from below. Freeze, all from that stillness, and suddenly sounds rush in. The chittering of birds on the deck, the faint murmur of the heater, the clink of a spoon in a cup. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and shake off the last dregs of sleep. Yes, Mum, be right down, I call as I finish making the bed. I'm home, or at least at my parents' house for Christmas. We decided, my better half and I, that it would be easier if I came up alone, since the borders were still closed to foreigners because of the virus. To be honest, it was a nice change of pace, and I truly missed being in a snowy clime for the holidays. Through the space of the half-closed door, I glanced into my parents' bedroom and think I see a body-shaped lump still tucked under the blankets. Funny, Dad is usually the first one up. First time for everything, I guess. Slowly, I make my way down the stairs, pausing to look at the art Mom had lovingly hung. A little piece from each place they've traveled to. A handmade souvenir to be enjoyed instead of stuffed into a drawer, never to be looked at again. One day, they'll be able to add new ones. Pausing at the landing, a small smile steals across my face as I glance at the tree and the decorations on the mantel. Another treasure trove of nostalgia. We'd collected the decorations over decades. It was always fun to decide the theme and reminisce as we unwrapped each little bauble. I round the corner, surprised to see my mum at the dining room table and not her usual perch in the kitchen. "Good morning," I chirp as I hug her, but it doesn't feel right. "Good morning, honey." I paused, and my arms slackened. "Are you feeling okay, Mum?" I pull back to see her face. Her eyes meet mine and something cold and flat flashes across. Here and gone so fast I must have imagined it. "Never better. Why do you ask, sweetheart?" She smiles and pats my hand, a gesture both familiar and alien. I step back, nonplussed. "Oh, it's nothing. Things just seem a little off. Must have had a weird dream follow me from sleep. Well, have some tea and toast, kiddo. That'll set things all right." Grateful to focus on the mundane task of preparing my breakfast, I linger on each step, still not able to fully shake off the weirdness. I mentally go through the day's activities we have planned. So, we're going to play some Scrabble, then bake the butter tarts and meringues. I root around in several cupboards, finally finding the honey next to the flour in the pantry. Then head out for an appropriately socially distanced lunch at our tea house. Yum. Another search turns up the butter on the windowsill by the sink. And maybe on the way home, pick up some Chinese from that amazing place in the village. Yeah, this'll be great. Satisfied with my effort to brighten my mood, I spare a look out the kitchen window across the white expanse outside, the snow glittering against the bright blue sky. I take a deep breath and carry up my cup and plate to the table. Determined to stay in good spirits, smiling at Mum, I drizzle honey over my nicely charred toast and happily tuck into a brekkie. "Oh," she says lightly, "by the way, Dad stepped out. Said he wanted a new mask. The one he's using is too old now." I laugh because that's so Dad. Anytime he'd pass in front of a mirror, he'd playfully preen and give himself a thumbs up. Now he was all about collecting stylish masks to coordinate with his outfits. But wait, isn't he still sleeping? I thought I saw him in bed. Mum's smile falters, but then comes back, bigger, brighter. Did she always have such a wide mouth? Oh, silly me. Of course he's still sleeping. I meant he'd be going out later. She takes a sip of tea, slurping, giving me a sidelong glance. I absent-mindedly take another bite of toast, feeling unsettled, a frisson of electricity flittering across my shoulders and the back of my neck. Another slurp, and another look. Is there something wrong with her face? The right side almost looks like it's sagging. She reaches across and pats my hand again, her hand clammy, bony. Could it be a stroke? I look more closely, trying to see the telltale signs. And then I notice it, a thin, red line just under her jaw, by her ear. What is that? Mum, what's that on your neck? What do you mean, sweetheart? A pause. Kiddo? Another pause. Then, in that tone, when you figured out the trick, dear, is that blood? I see it more clearly now, the line. It's tracing along her jaw, spreading, widening. Oh, God, what's wrong with your face? My voice falters, catching in my throat. It's hard to swallow. She gracefully touches her hand to her neck, peering wryly at the smudge left on her fingers like it's an inconvenience, a small frustration. Sometimes with older ones, they don't sit right. You have to adjust. The soft laugh and the sigh. And then she straightens in her chair. I'm flushed and freezing, cemented to mine. Still smiling, that too wide grin, she grasps her face with one hand and casually pulls. What? Her face coming away with a squelch. What? Ribbons of sticky. What is happening? Ichor suspended between rivulets of claret trailing down her neck. What the I stammered. Language, dear, the thing holding my mother's face says. With a grunt of effort, I fling myself back from the table. Can't breathe. No, I don't. It's all right, dear. You'll see, it'll be all right, it says as it gently puts her face back on, smoothing the edges so they once again lie seamless against her. It's skin. I lurch out of the dining room, legs moving like molasses, like in a horror movie. A movie, a dream, this isn't real. While my non-mom turns in her chair to watch, I hear a thud from upstairs, knowing now it's not my dad, but another thing. I choke back a cry as I stumble towards the front door. Remember, dear, if you want to stay safe out there, a low chuckle follows. My fingers brush the cool handle, and then I'm gripping it, turning it, feeling the icy hair as the door cracks open. It is still at the table, watching, amused by my terror, my flight. So close I can make it. The door open wider now. Lets the winter chill wash over me. My foot touches the welcome mat. Oh God, I'm free. I'm safe. A breath, a blink, and a movement so fluid and swift it doesn't even register. And then a whisper, soft and ticklish against my ear. Face masks are required. Wow. That was creepy, not gonna lie. I always, anything that has to do with like body snatching or stuff inside your own house, that freaks me the hell out. That was a good one. That was good writing too. Once again, that was Face Mask Required, written by Lady Ravensdale. And the last one I have here for today is called simply 311, like the time 311, written by Uncle Tormented. Grab a sip of water here. Alright. Let's see now. The obnoxious buzzing from the dryer that signaled the end of the cycle came up faintly from the basement. Shane could already feel Jen's eyes boring into the side of his head. Shane kept his attention on the baseball game that was playing out on the TV. Are you gonna get that? You know how much I hate going into that basement at night, said Jen. Come on, babe. It's the 7th inning, another hour or so and it'll be over. It can hold. I wanted to get it done and folded before bed, after the game, Shane said. He didn't need to look over to see she wasn't happy at all about the situation. She'd live. With a loud sigh, Jen stood and walked in front of Shane toward the door to the basement. She jerked the door open, reached inside, and flipped the light switch 2 or 3 times. Letting out another loud sigh, she turned toward Shane. You still haven't fixed this light switch. I've only asked 100 times. I'll do it this weekend, promise. Hey, since you're up, will you grab me another beer? If looks could kill, Shane surely would have been dead at that moment. Jen mumbled something unintelligible, flipped him off, and headed down the basement stairs. Guess that's a no, Shane said to the empty room. Jen had only been gone a couple of minutes before a scream came from the basement. Shane rolled his eyes and stood up. Jen was so dramatic, he thought. Shane watched as the pitcher struck out the last batter. Giving a little arm pump, Shane made his way to the basement entrance. "You okay?" Shane called out. "Something bit me, as if you care." Before Shane could head down the stairs, Jen was hobbling up with a basket full of clothes under one arm. Shane reached for the basket and got the look of death once more. Backing up, Shane let her come out of the basement. Shane noticed her ankle was already beginning to swell a little, and he tried once again to grab the basket. Before Shane could get it, Jen had dropped the basket onto the table. "Let me take a look at your ankle," Shane said. "What, and make you miss your precious ball game? I'm going to bed." Shane watched her hobble down the hallway and into the bedroom. Shrugging his shoulders, he grabbed another beer and headed back to the recliner. Taking a swig of beer, he watched his team put another run on the board. With another win in the books for his team, Shane turned off the TV and shut down everything in the living room and kitchen on his way to bed. Stepping into the bedroom, he saw Jen was under the covers and facing towards the wall. Jen emitted a little snore. Thankfully, Shane wouldn't have to endure an argument. At least not right now. Dropping his jeans and t-shirt onto the floor, he climbed into bed and was asleep in a few seconds. Shane woke up suddenly with a strange feeling that someone or something was staring at him. He was facing towards Jen's side of the bed, but she wasn't there. Lifting his head, he turned to look over his shoulder, and a dark blur shot across his field of vision. Turning his head back toward the other side of the bed, Jen was back and sleeping peacefully. Shane sat up and shook his head a little. He squinted at the clock and it read 3:11. "Phew, no more pizza before bed for me," he mumbled. Did you say something?" asked Jen, obviously still asleep. "Nothing. Go back to sleep." Shane swung his legs out of the bed and put his feet on the floor. He looked around the dark room and back to Jen to make sure she was still there. Shane tried to play it off like it was nothing, just a dream brought on by the pizza and beer. Still, it unnerved him a little. Rubbing his face, he stumbled to the kitchen and got a drink of water before returning to bed. When the alarm rang at 6:30, he was still awake. "Hey, do you remember getting out of bed and staring at me last night?" Shane asked. "What? No. I woke up and you weren't in bed, and before I could turn around and back, you were back in bed again. Too many beers for you last night, cowboy." "I don't know. I've been up since then. Couldn't go back to sleep. Probably a guilty conscience for not going down into the basement last night for me," Jen said as she stepped out of bed. Shane watched as Jen hobbled around the bed and then into the bathroom. She was limping worse than last night. There was no way she had gotten out of bed and back as quick as that, whatever it was. "Damn," Jen exclaimed from the bathroom. "What's wrong?" Shane asked as he got out of bed. Shane pushed the door open to the bathroom, and Jen had her foot upon the toilet and was examining her ankle. It had swollen to the size of a softball and was bright red. Jen was touching her hand to her ankle when Shane stopped in the doorway. Shane could see 4 puncture wounds in a perfect square. These weren't little insect punctures. It looked like someone had taken a number 2 pencil and jabbed it into Jen's ankle. "What the hell bit you?" "Maybe you should think about getting it looked at," Shane asked. "I don't know. I heard a hiss and then I felt the jab in my leg. It It almost knocked me off my feet, and since when you're all concerned about me? A hiss? I guess it could have been a snake bite or something, but I haven't ever seen anything with a fang so big it would make a puncture like that. I'm going down to the basement to see what I can see, Shane said, brushing off the pointed question. Oh, now you want to go down there. Whatever it was, it's long gone by now. Great white hunter, Jen scoffed. Okay, you can knock it off, I'm sorry. Whatever. Shane left the bedroom and rummaged around in the kitchen until he found a flashlight with a half-dead battery. He tried the old bang the flashlight in your hand trick to get it to brighten up, but that didn't work either. Shane opened the basement door and instinctively tried the light switch. Jen snickered in the background. Shane started down the steps, sweeping the dying flashlight left and right in front of him. Shane stopped halfway down, crouched, and strained his eyes to see into the murky darkness. He made a mental note to get some batteries for the stupid flashlight the next time he was in town for fixing the light switch. Finally, he made it to the bottom of the stairs and swept the floor in front of him with the dimming light. Shane shuffled further into the basement. He stopped when he thought he heard breathing. Hello? Shane said, his voice cracking. Shane looked up to see what appeared to be two eyes glowing yellow. They were about 2 inches above his height of 6 feet. There was a distinct hiss, and Shane dropped the flashlight, turned, and ran up the stairs, taking 2 at a time. Once he reached the top, he slammed the door behind him and fell against the door. Shane was taking in huge gulps of air, and he could feel sweat starting to roll down from his back as he slid down the door into a seated position. Oh, geez, you're not going to believe this, but, Shane stopped in mid-sentence. Shane dug his heels into the tile and was trying to push the door behind him. Across the room stood a reptilian-like creature that had Jen's body, but a head that resembled a snake. Shane let out another scream. The creature started to speak as it morphed back into Jen. "Why are you screaming and why are you so pale?" Jen asked. "Because there is something not natural in the basement, and you were just looking like a snake or something." "A snake?" Jen laughed as her face glitched in and out of her real face in the snake head. "Oh jeez, I can't breathe. Calm down, you're just hyperventilating." "I can't calm down. There is something down there and you're turning into something." "Okay, well, yelling at me isn't going to solve anything." Jen took a step forward towards Shane, and he screamed again as he scooted away from her. She stopped and put her hands on her hips. She tried to advance once more, and Shane moved back once more. "Okay, I don't have time to play with you. I'm going to be late for work," Jen said as she limped back toward the bathroom. Shane fell over and he rested his cheek against the cool tile. He willed his heart to stop beating so fast. Shane lay there until Jen came back into the kitchen and started the coffee, and then turned and leaned back on the counter. Shane couldn't help but notice the gold flecks in her eyes. It hadn't been there before. Jen already thought he was crazy, so he thought better than mentioning it to her. "You going to work today, or are you just going to lay on the floor all day?" Jen asked. "Why are you being so mean? This is real. All of the years of verbal abuse you have dished out on me, and you want to call this mean? I don't know what you want me to say." "Nothing, Shane. I want you to say nothing. I'm going to work." After Jen left, Shane finally found the strength to stand. He struggled out to the garage and found a hammer and some nails. Once back inside, Shane began to pound nails into the door of the basement until he felt like it was fully sealed. Shane tested the door several times and felt like it was secure. He walked to the bathroom and shut and locked the door behind him. He quickly undressed and got into the shower. Shane showered facing the door and tried to keep at least one eye open as he was soaped up and rinsed off. His shower completed, Shane hurriedly got dressed. He wasn't even sure if what he was wearing matched, but he was out the door and in his truck in minutes. Shane fumbled 3 or 4 times with the keys, trying to get them into the ignition, dropping them once before the truck started. Shane, this is what we're gonna do. This is all your imagination. You had too many beers last night and it's starting to affect your mental health. So, no more alcohol. That's it. Not another drop. And you're gonna start appreciating Jen, Shane said to the empty truck cab. Shane barely made it through the workday. He had fallen asleep at his desk 2 or 3 times. Each time he jerked awake, Shane checked under his desk and scanned his office. Luckily, his boss hadn't got him. This wasn't like him at all. He wasn't scared of things that could go bump in the night. This thing, however, felt real. Shane almost fell asleep twice more on the way home. Finally, Shane turned onto his street, and he could see Jen's little sports car was already in the driveway. Parking his truck, Shane got out of it and walked to the house. Jen was standing in the front of the basement door staring at it when Shane walked in. "What the hell did you do to the door, Shane?" Jen said, turning toward him. I didn't want that thing in the house, said Shane. Shane walked to Jen and wrapped his arms around her. As soon as he got his arms around her, he jumped back with a look of horror on his face. He was still backing as Jen smiled at him, her eyes flashing gold. "Why are you so cold? What's wrong with your eyes?" "I haven't a clue about what you're talking about. I thought you were a big, strong man," Jen giggled. "This is crazy. I think I need a drink. Did you do something to me last night?" "What would I have done to you exactly?" Jen said, walking over and leaning against the counter. "Why aren't you limping? I know that thing didn't heal already." Jen shot across the kitchen in a blur, and she pressed against Shane's body. Shane felt the ice cold starting to seep into him. Jen was lowering his body heat. "You aren't scared, are you, macho man?" Jen said, her tongue flickering out and licking his ear. Shane tried to push her away, and it was like pushing against a brick wall. He was 6 inches taller and outweighed her by at least 50 pounds. He should have easily been able to push her away from him. Jen laughed as she backed off him. Her eyes returned to normal. "What do you want for dinner?" Jen said as nothing had happened. I don't think I'm very hungry." "Oh, are you not feeling well? Are you kidding right now?" "Shane, what's wrong, honey? You don't look well. Maybe you should go lay down." "I think I need some fresh air," Shane said. Shane turned to walk out of the kitchen and heard a faint hiss. Quickening his steps, he pushed open the screen door and found himself on the front porch. The weather was mild, but he was sweating buckets and shaking. Shane's legs felt like jelly, but he made his way down the front porch steps and into the yard. The neighbor, Brad, waved and approached the fence. "Geez, Shane, you look like crap. You okay, buddy?" "I don't know, I think I'm in a nightmare," Shane sputtered. "At 5 in the afternoon? You got a cigarette? When you quit, you said to not give you another, no matter how much you begged." "Cut the shit, Brad. I need one." "Damn, okay. No need to get violent." Brad took the pack from his breast pocket and shook his cigarette at the top. Shane could hardly control the shaking of his hand to pick the cigarette from the pack. Brad flicked his lighter and the flame jumped from the metal case. Shane barely got to light it before taking a long, deep drag. "You and Jen fighting or something?" "Something like that," Shane said, glancing back over at his house. "Well, you're welcome to the couch for a night, let things cool down or whatever." "I appreciate that, man. I might just take you up on that." "Seriously? Must have been a doozy of an argument." "Yeah, let me go tell her, and I'll be back." Without waiting for a reply, Shane turned toward his house and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Taking a deep breath, he walked up the steps and to the front door. Shane had his hand on the doorknob and took another deep breath as he turned the knob to open the door. He poked his head inside the door. "Hey, I think I'm gonna crash at Brad's couch tonight," Shane called. Jane appeared around the corner, dressed in her workout clothes. Her face was glitching in and out of the snake face again, and Shane felt a wave of nausea come over him. It was all he could do to keep his knees from buckling. "How cute, you think sleeping at Brad's will save you?" "What did you say?" "I asked why on earth would you do that," Jen answered. I need some space, I guess." "Space? Whatever, Shane." Jen didn't wait for an answer before turning from him and walking back into the kitchen. Shane didn't even want to go back into the house for clothes. He closed the door and walked as quickly as he could back to Brad's. Brad was rambling about throwing some steaks on the grill or something as Shane looked over his shoulder back at his house. Jen was standing in the kitchen window watching him. Jen wore an evil smile and Shane could make out another snake-like figure standing behind her. It was smiling too. Shane barely tasted the steak that Brad had made. He couldn't shake what he saw at the window. Shane endured an evening with Brad and his wife, talking about who knows what. Finally, he ran out of steam, and Brad's wife brought down some blankets and a pillow. Shane thanked them as they turned and left. They had turned off the lights as they had left out of the room. Shane quickly moved to the end of the couch and switched on a lamp. There was no way he'd be sleeping. The clock turned over to 3:11, and Shane was awoken by something bumping his leg. A rancid smell forced him to cough a little. Shane opened his eyes, and the Jen snake creature's face was less than half an inch from his. Shane tried to scream, but nothing came out. "You should not have fallen asleep, of course. It wouldn't have saved you," Jen hissed. Once again, Shane tried to scream but couldn't. His heart was racing and he saw a taller creature standing behind Jen. Jen raised her arms, and her hands had been replaced by what looked like talons. Shane was paralyzed and could do nothing as Jen dug her talons into each shoulder and raised him straight off of the couch. Shane's head flopped forward, and he could see his feet dangling a foot off the ground. Jen began to move effortlessly toward the door. Seconds later, Shane watched as his porch and then his entryway tile moved under his feet. Jen was more gliding than she was walking. Moments after that, he saw what he guessed was the basement door, scattered in shards all over the kitchen floor. Jen flung Shane down the steps. Shane landed awkwardly onto his back on the floor, and he heard a bone snap. He was still paralyzed, so he wasn't sure what had broken, but it couldn't be good. Looking up, he saw Jen and the other creature come down the steps. Shane wanted to move but couldn't. They both stood over him at his feet. The other creature reached out and touched Shane. Suddenly, a flood of pain hit him. He could now tell that the broken bone was his left leg. Shane hurt all over, but the broken bone and talon punctures were by far the worst. With his right leg, Shane began to try and move away from Jen and her friend. They looked at each other and laughed as they watched Shane struggle. Jen began to grow taller until she had reached the ceiling and hunched over. Shane knew the ceilings were 9 feet, so Jen had grown to 10+ feet. The last thing Shane remembered was Jen's face crashing down on his. He tried to utter a scream that never came. Wow. That was definitely an interesting story. That was also done by Uncle Tormented. So there you go. 3 creepypasta stories for tonight. I hope you're not too scared. Like I said, I'm just here reading them for you. There's no reason to be scared. You're perfectly safe. They're just stories. So, I thank you once again for listening. I love you all very, very, very much. So, take care, my friends. Be well, stay well, and I will see you in the next